without too much ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our panellists. They're each going to introduce their thoughts to you with a few comments, and then we're going to open everything up to the floor and try and start a real discussion. So please hold any thoughts that you come up with, anything that you want to respond to in what you hear, and we'll have an opportunity for that to come out. So our first panellist is Peter Ventre. He's from Halton, Adult Social Care. And so the question I'm asking Peter is, should loneliness be tackled by the adult social care teams in our communities? And there is your slide.
Is it up there?
Yep, no, one more click.
Okay. My name's Peter, as Kate said. I think you're going to be asked to vote about who should lead on loneliness at the end of this session. What I would say is I represent myself personally. I've been at a few of these meetings where people think I'm the bin man, and they've had problems with the bins, and so I would ask you not to vote if you've had some wounds from your local authority, but rather vote on the content of what I say if you would. If you can see from the chart there, what I'm going to go through is trying to explain what happened in Halton. We had a top-down approach. What I mean by that, we tried to, I'd like to say it happened all strategically. We were all whiz-bang, we were all singing from the same hymn sheet. But what actually happened is we started a series of dream workshops for older people. And during these dream workshops, for a day, older people would talk about the dreams maybe that they'd forgotten. Maybe you've forgotten what your dreams are, why you came into the work, but that was certainly illuminating the comments they made. And what we tried to do during that day, some of them came along with their carers, and we had made conscious efforts to try and get people out who'd been seen as lonely. And during those dream workshops, the dreams that came up were quite easy to fulfill. We had people there who could fulfill those dreams, agencies, other older people. Say one person who said, well, I forgot I wanted to be a nurse when I was younger. Quite easy then during the day to find some sort of care and voluntary work for her to do. That fulfilled her dream. Another person said, I can't go out and I'm lonely, and the reason I'm lonely is because I'm frightened of lifts. Something quite basic like that. Quite easy then to get her own lift where she could practice with someone, getting a little bit less frightened about those sorts of issues. So it was bubbling up gently about loneliness from these dream workshops. We moved those on then to, and we're doing this all the time now, we're into our second area, a workshop that said, what would it take in this place? It was actually a place called Windmill Hill. The clue is in the title, it's Hill. What would it take in Windmill Hill to make it a better place to grow older in? And again, with groups of older people, some of the agencies, and every single time the problem of loneliness came up. We need to do something about loneliness in this area. What can you do? You work for the council. You've got all these connections. What can you do? So with the help of the older people, we started getting in touch with some of the local agencies. And if you have a look at the chart, one of the things they said is, people in care homes, you think they're not lonely. Well, they are lonely. We'd like to do something about that. And they also said it would be better in this place to make it grow older in if we had better relations with some of the younger people. We do clearly said we want to have a lot of connections with younger people. So it was quite easy then because we got good connections with local care homes and schools. There's still quite a few connections from local authorities with the schools to actually start to twin up local care homes with local schools, many of which were up for it. They really fancy having a go at it. So we've just started that work. So I think the case I'm trying to make for local authorities leading, although the chart obviously shows it's a multi-agency approach, but I've been asked to be provocative, so I will be. The case is that we're well connected. We know a lot of people. So in that first slide there, on the right there, the care homes, yeah, that worked well, is starting to work well. On the left there, you've got the social groups. Clearly, people were saying in these workshops, we'd like more social groups, and we'd like them to be, and clearly to be run by us, not by the likes of you. So again, it was quite easy, because public health have come over to local authorities, it was quite easy to get a health improvement team and the community development team working together in groups that were already existing, because quite often you've got lots of existing groups, but they're struggling. And to try and find some seed money to keep them going. That was one tack we took. And then we also got groups of people, older people who were meeting together for a short term. We run an Apex group for people who have balance problems. It's all around falls. They meet for 6 to 8 weeks, and then the group goes. And they don't see each other again, unless they're very lucky. So what we try to do is make those longer-lived, those groups. So again, a little bit of seed money, a little bit of support at the start, and we've had some good results on that, on the group running itself. There are loads of issues with groups running themselves, but we've had some success at that. Yeah, and then we got a group of people said, we've heard about this Skype thing. Is there anything you could lead on that? We haven't got anything to do our Skype with. We've heard we can talk to people, our relatives abroad and the rest of it. And I suppose this is where the quite good connections comes in again. The local CCG, we've got good connections with them as well as, thank you. We've got good connections with them, and they came up with some money. The statistic that 1 in 10 people coming into the GP surgery are coming in regarding loneliness made them sit up and have a little think. And they came up with some money, and we invested in these little things, which are VisBuzz, which is a cheap Skype, very simple, which you can, you just have the picture of your loved ones or your carers, whoever it is, and you just press it, and it comes through. And again, some good early results on that, although there's lots of technological issues, as you might, older people always find the flaws in your technology. And they certainly have it in this. But it's a multi-strand approach. And I think if you're going to take a multi-strand approach, the local authority are quite well situated because, as I say, we know a lot of people. And also, very, very often the solutions are simple. We had one group who said, do you know what's really keeping us in our homes and we can't get out and it's making us lonely is a lack of benches. And again, not a difficult thing to do, put benches in an area. Again, it was in Windmill Hill, which is hilly. So people said, well, we can't get very far without having to go back. And that's actually what's keeping us within our communities. So I suppose what I'm saying is the people to lead really are older people themselves. If we're going to get any real successes. And because I'm sitting here representing local authority, I'd say, vote for us, you know, when it's time to vote. Okay, that's all.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Okay, so local authorities are well connected. They know their communities. They should be taking a lead on loneliness, or should they? And then we might have slightly given away the next key group in just at the end there, because I want to introduce Vivienne G, who wears a number of hats, as many people in this room probably do too, but is particularly involved with the North West Age Action Alliance and various other bodies. The question I'd like you to address is, should community groups and individuals be leading the charge against loneliness?
Thank you. Yes. Basically, I think that communities do have a really vital role in sort of stirring up things within their own localities. Mostly because if you're local, you know what your local services are in the main, you know who the people are, and you know if somebody is on their own. But having said that, there are problems, because very often when you have a community that gets together, it's very often the same people who will actually come together to do something, so, you know, the usual suspects. And very often there's a funding problem. Very often you might need pump priming, or if you have a community centre or something like that, it might need maintaining. So it's not all sort of plain sailing to actually get a focus within the community. And I'd actually like to try and illustrate this with two examples, really. One where community does work very well that I'm involved in, and one where it doesn't. And I'm using as examples myself and my dear old mum. As far as I'm concerned, I live in Darnhall in Cheshire, which is a very small, it's really a hamlet more than anything, and then it has a parish of about 200 people. And we have a village hall, which several years ago we bought for a very nominal price off the local landowner. But we then actually had to find the funding to actually get this thing sort of refurbished, really, and try and get it off the ground and try and get more use out of it. And so a group of us got together, and some of us, for our sins, had bid writing experience, and we managed to get the funding. And we now have a really thriving sort of community centre out of this village hall. And in fact, it's our village hall day on Saturday, so if you're passing. And what actually happens there, we have lots of groups meeting, we have dancers, we have guys, we have WI, we hire it out, and I mean that can be a problem as well, is actual charging. Where you do have a community centre, it can be expensive, but again we try and keep the sort of funding, the costs rather, down to a minimum. But what it means is that there is actually a focal point for the community. I live just up the road, so it's, you know, sort of a hop, skip and a jump really for me to actually go to anything there. As a result of all of this, I've really got to know my neighbours very well. And I know that if I have a problem, if I'm feeling a bit down or a bit lonely, I can actually sort of go to the neighbours and they'll help out. And the other week, actually, I had some furniture being collected, and the van that came backed into my gate, and, you know, everybody came out because this was the local entertainment. So, you know, the community is really quite a solid community there. My poor old mum, she's nearly 91. She lives on her own in London, lives on what was a big council estate, which is now some housing association rented, some private property, some private let. But being London, it is incredibly diverse. It's absolutely fantastic to be there because you've got every nationality under the sun. It really is like the United Nations. And so basically there, she, as I say, is 91. She has outlived all of her neighbours virtually, and if she hasn't outlived them, they've moved away. Because you've got such wonderful ethnic diversity, people tend to sort of stay within their own groups. There is no community centre, a physical building. The nearest one is the local church hall, which is about a quarter of a mile walk away. And that at the moment I think is now a Hindu centre, so obviously, you know, that's working for that particular group. But there's no buses. And my mother is housebound, so she can't even sort of get out in the garden to even watch as people come walking past. And I like to think when you're talking about benches, because just to swing from my mother, in Tarpley they actually have benches where people sit down. And there was a lovely old lady who used to actually come out every day and sit there, and you would talk to her, and, you know, she would talk to you. So obviously she was lonely. She actually sort of got out and about. But I think the whole thing, really, to try and sum all of this sort of up, is really, when we talk about community, we're talking about individuals. So as I say, my community, there's a group of really, really solid, enthusiastic, committed individuals. Where my mother lives, they're lovely people, but have busy lives, you know, different sort of focal points. And it's very, very difficult to sort of get anything together. And as a result of it, my mother can be very, very lonely indeed. And just as a very, very final thing, it's not, although I say community should lead, it is other groups as well. We've talked about GPs this morning, councils, other charities and so forth, but also as well, it's ourselves. And if you are lonely, if you are able to get out and about, if you're not frail and housebound, if it's not a cost factor, then like the lady who sits on the bench in Tarpley, get out there and meet people, because that's one of the ways of doing it. And one of the best ways is to join with your local community, do something for your community, and take advantage of what your community offers. Thank you.
Okay, so communities are critical, but it depends a bit on the community. So maybe we need to think about what we can do to help all communities become like the best that we see out there. So the next group to consider where their role is, should they be taking the lead in tackling loneliness, is the voluntary sector and voluntary organisations like that of UK Cheshire. And Ken Clemens is going to talk to us about what role... There you go. What role the voluntary sector should be playing in tackling loneliness.
Right. Thanks, Kate. Can I just see a show of hands? How many people here are involved in a voluntary or community organisation in any way?
I think you're going to win.
It's nice to be amongst friends, hopefully. I think that shows quite a bit, really, in the sense of, it's everybody's responsibility. I'm not going to advocate this sector against other sectors. It has to be everybody's responsibility. And I think there's lots of things that people could do in a different way and could do a lot more over this issue. And I think we've got a debt of gratitude for the campaign to end loneliness that actually brought this to the top of the agendas. When I hear directors of public health talk now, it's not merely obesity or teenage pregnancy. I actually see loneliness. They have a slide on loneliness. And that's quite a change from 5 or 6 years ago. So the campaign's done a terrific job in actually getting this to the top of the agenda. And it's probably an issue which we've known about for years. It's not a sudden issue. In saying that, I will try and be provocative. Are we going to make a difference? Is it going to get better in the next 5 years? The issue of loneliness and how we address it? Is the change possibly maybe a change of deterioration? Lots of changes are happening in how we live. We know that 80% of the spending cuts haven't happened yet. They're coming in after the next general election. We know welfare reform, we know changes across our society, we know technological change. The digital change is probably making the biggest difference to our lives currently. We may not be aware of it, but it is. So in the context of this, are things going to get better for us? And this is happening right across Western Europe. There's a trend here. And it's great to hear about community, lots of stuff going on, befriending, lots of activities. But there's a general envelope of change right across Western Europe about how we're living our lives. And I think we need to think about that. And certainly for us as a sector, the voluntary sector, we need to think about that rather than sort of try and go against the grain of this. And I think in some sense of the tools that we use. I talked first of all about volunteering. It's fundamental to what we do in UK Cheshire. We have fortunate to have over 400 volunteers, over 3,000 members of our engagement group. And they do, we would not be able to be there without them. But we also know that profile of that volunteers are getting older. And there's something about volunteering to me as how we label it, how we describe it, that perhaps needs a refresh. And can we incentivise volunteering? Can we incentivise good social action, good social behaviour? Is that something that we actually ought to be thinking about? And again, if you look at good practice from elsewhere in Europe, they've incentivised volunteering for quite a while. The Netherlands has a befriending scheme in place for the last 10 years. That if you befriend an older person, once you reach the age of 18, they have a national befriending scheme, and you befriend an older person and you develop a long-standing relationship, you actually get free rail travel. So there's ways of actually incentivising and embedding and changing our behaviours that the state has a function to do, but the voluntary sector needs to challenge itself and look about its role. Look how it's used volunteers. We've got the idea of micro-volunteering for lots of younger people. They like to come in, whiz into a project, see it finished off, and then go. It's slightly different to what we're offering, so it's a challenge to us. I'll also throw the challenge out there around digital, and I know the 70% of the spend, our public sector spend, goes on predominantly those sort of 30-odd, 20-odd% of people who are not digitally connected. But digital is important. And increasingly it's going to be more and more important. Our services are going to be digital by default, our public services, rightly or wrongly. And we need to think more carefully about how we can blend the digital with all these face-to-face stuff that we do in UK Cheshire. On my table there was a picture of one of the cards. You notice it was a picture of the Queen. Now, the Queen took part in something 2 weeks ago called Tech at the Palace. And there she was able to do some work with some guys that we'd done some work with called SpeakSet. SpeakSet enables Skype through your TV. So you can Skype somebody through your TV. Very easy remote, 2 buttons, bump, bump. I've got one for my father who lives in the Netherlands. So at night now, I don't just ring him up and say, how are you? All is good. I can see him. He presses a button, he sees me, I see him. So when he says, yeah, all is good, I know if all is good. Now that simple technology, it's delivered through a TV set, which is familiar interface. It's potentially game-changing. So how can we as a voluntary sector adopt that, promote it, champion it? work with our partners in the public sector, with public health, to embed this in new ways. So challenge I'll throw out to people is around volunteering. Have we got it right? Are we making the right offer? Is there more we can do? How do you feel about incentivising volunteering? Or is that, you just don't go together? And about technology. Yes, lots of other people are not using digital tools. We need to change that as much as we possibly can, but also acknowledge some older people never will or never want to. But we need to blend it. We need to use that digital with all the opportunities which it gives us to try things in new ways. One final one before I go to Paul is about funding. And again, there's a route there for the voluntary sector and a challenge to the voluntary sector. We need to offer solutions to funders. And we need to think about funding in new ways. And the challenge I throw out to commissioners and colleagues in health is that they need to move away from a linear commissioning model. If they've got some money and they want to deliver outcomes, then they need to have a conversation with the voluntary sector, because I could probably turn that amount of money with social investment, with payment by results, with social philanthropy, with a whole range of things, mixing with charges, to a larger pot of money, so we can deliver even better outcomes. It's not just about going to commissioners and expect to be funded. We need to think differently about funding. We need to blend funding streams. We need to mix charge for services up with investment type services. There's lots changing out there, and the sector needs to get onto that. These are all the things we need to do if we're going to make a difference. And again, I'm open-minded as we will make a difference, because the bigger envelope, I think if we can stay where we are, we've achieved something, is that we're going to have a difficult next 10 to 15 years, and there's a massive sort of social change coming through. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so a clear role for the voluntary sector, but has the voluntary sector got some work to do? And I just wanted to, I'm sure the campaign would want me to flag that the questions around digital are something that the campaign itself is going to be delving into and exploring more. So keep an eye on the campaign's website and blog for more information about that issue. But we'll move seamlessly on now to Paul McGarry from Public Health Manchester to take the last bid for your views. Should loneliness be led from a public health perspective?
Can you hear me okay? I've worked in local government for over 20 years, so I'm going to vote for PISA, because well, I thought that, then I heard Viv, and then I heard Ken, and I guess the answer is that we all know is that we're all involved in this. I want to make kind of 2 or 3 key points really here, I think. And some of these may be controversial. I hope so. Well, no, I don't hope so. I hope you all agree with me. I think the first one, in terms of this agenda, in terms of the ageing agenda, and I've been involved in this kind of stuff for over 15 years now. We remember at the dawn of the kind of Blair government, the Better Government for Older People programmes, POPs, Short Start to Later Life, etc., 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 is that we're in a moment, we're in a time since 2010 where we haven't had a national ageing strategy. Okay, so we don't have a national framework in which we can mobilise all the partners, whether it's from the NHS, from local government, or from the voluntary sector. So I think that's one of the things that's missing. And if public health can bring anything to the table, and it can bring many things, it's about creating a framework, a national framework. We've got one in Wales, we've got one in Scotland, we don't want to have one in England at the moment. It's a huge gap if you think about the scale and scope of the issues that we're talking about. That's the first thing. And I do want to touch on funding as well, because one of the challenges for us in the big urban areas, the big cities, is that if you look at Manchester between 2011 and 17, the amount of money that the council receives will have reduced by something around 45% of our budget. Now, in that context, trying to deliver these types of programmes that look at the wider determinants of ageing and loneliness, whether it's transport, housing, keeping our estates clean and tidy, is a huge challenge. And we need to find ways to mobilise other actors. But we can't imagine for a moment that the impact of those things as we move forward, as Ken said, over the next 5 years, are going to be profound and significant. So there's that issue. I think at a local authority level, I want to talk about two different other levels. So there's a national issue, and I think those of us involved in this work need to be saying those things very clearly, particularly as we move into the election period, that there needs to be a narrative around ageing, which isn't about older people as victims, isn't about ageing as a burden, but actually sees the contribution that older people play in our communities. So that's the first thing. The second thing really is at a local authority level, because, as colleagues have said, public health moved into local government, in my opinion, and I can't speak for anybody else, in my opinion, at probably the worst time since 1975, if you think about the context of the funding arrangements. But it has enabled us to join together teams working at a population level in our local authorities. I think there's a challenge for public health, so maybe this is the other issue, a controversial issue or not, is that traditionally public health has seen older people in terms of diseases, and we need to shift that away from a disease focus to a citizenship focus. We need to look at the communities in which older people live and look at how public health with others such as the voluntary sector, housing organisations and so on, can invest in communities to change neighbourhoods and promote different types of neighbourhoods. And in Manchester and in 11 other cities that we work with, we talk about age-friendly communities and neighbourhoods. I guess which leads on to the final point, which is at that neighbourhood level. I'm absolutely convinced that in terms of people being commissioners or investors from the NHS, from local government or from other sectors, and this includes some of the big national ageing charities, is that we've got to stop looking at, and I can use this great term, it's kind of linear investment. You know, we invest in a service here, you guys invest in a service here, and so on. Actually, and a lot of this has been done already. But this is nothing new, but we need to start looking at it from the perspective of the neighbourhood, the older people who live there. And we've done some pioneering work in some of our communities, which has been led by researchers from sociology and from urban design perspectives. So everything from the benches right through to the social aspects of ageing, through to the transport. All these things need to be connected, and actually public health, being in local government, offers a fantastic platform to do that. So those are really my key messages. We need to stop looking at diseases. We need to stop looking at older people necessarily as passive recipients of services and as social actors who can change their communities. And local authorities and their partners need to invest in neighbourhoods and communities, firstly, but also in the wider determinants of poor ageing as well. And the last point I just wanted to make, research is important. We've had I guess almost a 10-year partnership now with some of the country's leading social research on ageing. But actually we know enough to make a difference now. We can't wait for the research to come through and tell us, you know, this is the fine grain of the argument. We need to act now, and we need to develop partnerships that can make change now.
Okay, so a role for public health, but maybe public health needs to challenge itself, so echoing some of the things Gregor said, but also a new actor that has some work to do, the national government, in terms of setting a strategy. Now, we did talk about voting, and I you know, obviously, if I ask you all to vote, then, you know, we're just having a popularity contest, so we won't do that. What I would like you to do is to vote on who do you think has the most, the furthest yet to travel of these actors. Who needs to do more? Who needs to up their game in tackling loneliness? So the options are, the local authorities need to do more. Have they got a really long distance to go before understanding this issue? How's our health? And we're going to broaden out to look at the health system. Do they have the most to do? Voluntary organisations, we've heard some challenges for voluntary organisations. Have they got a lot more to do? Or is it communities themselves who've got the biggest role, the biggest gap between where they ought to be and where they are now? So who would say it's local authorities in this room? There you go. So the question is, who needs to do more? Which of the organisations we've been discussing has the most work yet to do to be in the right place on loneliness? So local authorities, we had a few hands. That's a vote of confidence in local authorities. How about the health system? Who thinks the health system needs to change to tackle loneliness more effectively? Brilliant. Excellent. If only I had to take a photo. What about community organisations? Who thinks the voluntary sector, if it's honest, has got a lot more it could be doing in this area? And what about communities, individuals and communities, older people themselves? Who thinks that they still have a long way to go? Interesting. So big challenges for health, but also big challenges for communities. The other key question, and this is where our roving mites needs to start roving, because I'm going to be wanting to point to people, and this is for one-word answers. Okay, what other key bodies have a really important role to play in tackling loneliness that we haven't mentioned, that aren't local authorities, the health system, communities, or voluntary sector organisations? What other key bodies should be part of this mix in tackling loneliness? Hands, one-word answers. Let's go to the middle table there. We've got 2 hands there. Yep.
Education, I think, start with the children. Perfect. You know, definitely, because it's a change of culture.
Excellent.
The older people themselves.
Excellent.
It's actually 3 words: community interest companies.
Perfect. Great. Yep.
Retailers.
Wow. Explain that. Just explain that. I'm going to give you a couple of extra words.
Massive infrastructure for selling things to all of us, which is increasingly getting us to do it in an atomistic way without contact with other people. And it seems very helpful to have everything delivered to us or to have the automatic checkouts, but all of that is reducing the amount of contact we have in the place we all go to at some stage during the week at the moment.
So remembering the human touch. Okay, at the back there.
Transport providers.
Absolutely, transport providers. I would be very shocked if they hadn't come up. At the back there.
Housing associations.
Fantastic. Again, just a couple of extra words. What would you say housing associations have got to do on this?
I think we can actually learn a lot from housing associations. Different sectors can, because housing associations work very much in a partnership arena. They know who their lonely people are, and they put things in place to ensure that they do have contact time. But I think sometimes we work in silos because of how funding works, and we need to stop that. Okay, and it is, just again, show of hands, is anybody optimistic that the Care Act will help bring housing more into the mix with health and social care? I know it wants to. Anybody optimistic about that? Oh dear, very pessimistic. Okay, well maybe that's an area that still needs looking at some more. Okay, I'm going to throw it open to some wider comments. Has anybody been made to think by anything that came up on the panel? Anybody got anything that they think we need to hear based on what's just been said? Okay, go to the gentleman here.
It's pretty obvious what I'm going to ask. What does the panel think? Nobody's mentioned what the role or what they think of community interest companies who play a part in social products, which we do.
Okay, fantastic. Hold that thought, and we'll come back for comments. And yep, the gentleman on the same table.
Thank you. Well, Ken was talking about digital technologies, and I think it's a massive opportunity. The reason being, I've heard a lot about funding cuts and expenses being lost, and which usually transpires into loss of hard infrastructure. And wherever there's a lack of hard infrastructure, digital technologies usually provide an antithesis or a counterbalance as soft infrastructure, if I may, which is what's happened in developing countries. For instance, there are no roads, but mobile phones have just completely transformed the economies because people don't need roads anymore. I mean, it's a controversial statement, but it has helped them a lot.
Okay, so getting a little bit into the technology friend or foe argument there. To the panel, maybe just one or two of you have any burning points you'd like to make in relation to the comments we've just had?
I think the question about CI, community interest companies, is an interesting one, a good one. There is, in most areas, I sit as part of something called Cheshire and Social Enterprise Partnership, which picks up and promotes the growth of community interest companies and social enterprises and a whole range of other vehicles which are out there. I think this is something, again, for a challenge for our sector. There's new forms of delivery, community interest companies being one of them, and it's about choosing the right model for the outcomes you want to deliver. So, you know, it's not just the voluntary sector in its traditional form, it's about adopting the right vehicle for the outcomes that you want to deliver. And in some cases, community interest companies are the best vehicle for actually doing that, and give that flexibility, that blend between a commercial organisation and the voluntary sector. I think the digital one, yeah, basically. I don't think we can quite grasp the changes which are happening around us regarding digital. And you know, in a sense of, yes, I know lots of other people don't use and won't use video. I know, let's put that to one side. That's important, recognise that. But there's stuff going on there around us. Our lives are being changed fundamentally by digital technologies as we sit here in this point in time. How are we going to, and I'll talk about data. There's great efficiencies, I think, and also better outcomes can be achieved if we start sharing data, both a level of personalised data, but also open data. We can target that increasingly rare resource, which is public spend, a lot more effectively if we share data, if we get to understand our communities, if we gain insight. It's not just involvement or engagement, it's actually insight. We need to actually understand the DNA of our communities. That can be, you can help to do that through sharing of data and use of data. And this is going to make, fundamental changes are already happening to our lives. The pace of these changes is only going to increase.
Okay, more comments?
I think I'd like to make the point that's obvious, but it isn't anybody, one person, it's about partnership working. And I think I would really like to make the point of how difficult partnership working really is. And we nod to it and we say, oh yeah, we're going to meetings or whatever. But partnership working where you get true partnership working, where everybody's an equal, including citizens, and people who really have a view that don't have the skills to participate equally with some of the people that come along with history of being in local authorities, even organised charities, whatever, public health, tend to get overwhelmed. And I think it goes back to the point you were making about data sharing, case study sharing good practice, trying to get that over, trying to support communities who want to build CICs or whatever they want to build. And this issue of partnership working and the investment and time it takes to do it is not recognised in any funding streams or anything. And it's about it being on everybody's job description, everybody's community champion. And it's difficult. And I think we have to recognise that, fund it and grow it, and really invest in it in a meaningful way.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to come back to you, and I was just going to see if there was any other comments or reflections on partnership working, specifically on partnership working, before we come back to the panel for their reflections. Some of them have been doing it. They'll probably have the wounds to tell the tale. Anybody other comments on partnership working? Gentleman here.
Hello. I'm the chair of St Helens CCG, and as such, I sit on the Health and Wellbeing Board. And I have to say, I've come up from business, and the Health and Wellbeing Board, to me, is the key driver which can really move the community. Because all the key decision makers in the local area sit around that Health and Wellbeing Board. And it should be given that the direction should come and the leadership should come from that board. And it should be quite clear in the strategy exactly where the community is going. And what we've done is we've lost our sense of community because of social mobility and everything else that goes on. And the best way that we can really connect with the people is to have focal points in the neighbourhoods or into localities within the local area, because each locality would have a different requirement from urban areas to central areas. So you've got a lot more deprivation in the central areas. And as a result, you really start to engage with the people, and we've got to get the people engaging and seeing that there's a focal point where they can connect to. And I see that the Health and Wellbeing Boards are a very key player in making it happen.
Great, thank you. Any other reflections on partnership working? The lady in the middle there. Yeah.
Can I just ask if every partners who are here today or anyone in the national or whether it's local, could it be incorporated in any assessment that a person's given to be done? Ask the question, are you lonely? Do you know where to get support with that? Could that line be put into all assessments that people are actually undertaking? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who would agree that that would be a sensible way to go. The question is, and some of the questions the campaign are grappling with is, you know, how do you ask those questions in a way that elicits the best answer? But I think it's a very live area, and I think there is growing interest in the issue. Partnership working panel. I know, Peter, you had some reflections.
I've got mainly me back, I have to say. I suppose I'd be talking about making partnership working gentle. And by gentle, I mean a partnership working that invites older people to be on any meeting you're at. The way we speak, professionals, we think we know all the answers. When you're on different boards and the rest of it, they're terrifying places to be sometimes for me, and I've got a lot of experience, but sometimes you see older people struggling on those boards because they're not gentle, and sometimes we're not gentle with each other. The professionals aren't gentle. There's a lot of turf wars going on, so I think I'd be pushing about just being gentle, and it's only when you're gentle. It's not a very popular word, gentle, these days. It's got to be target driven, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, whiz bang. But I like the gentle, and I think that organic approach works much better than where we have people along to meetings who, let's face it, they get lonely there when they're in the meeting because they feel excluded. So I'm one for the gentle.
Yes, I sort of particularly picked on what you just said about turf wars, because some of the experience of partnership working that I've had, that's very much been the case, that people come along to these meetings with the best of intentions, with the big picture, but then suddenly, you know, it's, well, what am I going to get out of this? Or what's my organisation going to get out of this? So I'm now really going to date myself and just say that there used to be a wonderful hippie phrase, which was leave your ego at the door. And that's what I would say about when you're going into these meetings, think of what you're there for, and let's have proper partnership and not these ego trips. And that's another old word.
Yeah, partnership working, you know, different definitions depending on which sort of sector you're in, who you're at, where you're at in your journey locally. Health and wellbeing boards, you know, it's when they're good, they're very, very good. But when they're bad, you know, and I think it's about having the right people. There's lots of variation on health and wellbeing boards. Some health and wellbeing boards just keep the statutory people who should be mandated to be there. I think they're missing a trick there because they're not picking up the voices, the wider voices. They do have a role in leading, you know, if they get the right people around the table, if they can pick up that insight from their communities. The idea of sort of locally based delivery of services, yes, you know, and it's amazing how things come around again. Because, you know, I remember I was involved working for Manchester local authority 20 odd years ago. And we had new neighbourhood based teams and neighbourhood delivery, and lots of investment in that. Things do come round again. I would say that there is a change going on out there. People are becoming less attached on the basis of geography. So there is a health warning to putting everything down to a particular level of delivery or an area of delivery. Because of digital channels, people are having different connections. You can connect through your community of interest through digital. People are becoming more network neighbourhoods because of digital. Again, how this impacts on the people we're trying to address in isolation and loneliness is debatable. But this is a trend that's happening. So yes, you know, work out on a geographical basis, but keep an eye on how the social trends are changing and how people are having a less attachment to locality and more attachment through digital connections.
Paul?
I think I see this, I mean, the partnership thing, and, you know, if we made a wish and we tried to get rid of turf wars and egos and all the rest of it, we'd do well, and I think it is a wish in a way because that's the world we live in. But I think for me it's a question of leadership more than anything. The Audit Commission produced a report, I think it was 2008, about how local authorities are preparing for ageing populations. And I'm going to make a figure up, but I think it's about right. Something like 66% really didn't have any proper plans in place for their population and ageing populations, and not just in terms of health and social care services, but overall how the local bins are organised, how local leisure services are configured and so on and so forth, how older people are involved in what's now called co-production, which again is it seems to me a new term that describes something that many of us have been involved in for a long time. Now, I don't know, the way I see it, I suspect local authorities may be even in a worse situation than in terms of planning for ageing populations in that holistic kind of broad perspective, because they're focused on the most immediate demands that they see in front of them. And there's one other thing as well that I just wanted to mention here, is that part of my job, and I'm sure my colleagues are the same, we read lots and lots of reports and strategies and documents, particularly those from local government, which set out their plans and vision around this agenda. And almost inevitably, and almost without exception, they tend to be framed from the perspective of the health and social care professional, okay, rather than the perspective of the city or the town or the people who live in it. And I think, if anything, if we take away one thing, we need a paradigm shift away from a health and social care narrative of ageing to one which is a citizenship. And I drive this point home again, where older people are leaders, social actors, the people who make the places in which they live. That seems to me to be the critical message in this agenda as we move forward.
Great. Got time for maybe one or two last comments from the floor, and then we're just going to ask the panel for a sentence to conclude. So the gentleman over there.
I'm listening to the panel talk, and it sounds like the older people seem to be the excuse for everything that can't be done. You know, we haven't got the money because of the aging population, as if the aging population didn't work when they were younger, didn't put things into the community. But what really, we need to find out what causes social isolation and repair it. Not talk about it, find out what causes it. Like housing policies where they shove old people out somewhere in the country and they don't put a bus stop by there. Don't put a doctors near them and things like that. Social isolation is caused by man. Loneliness is a different thing altogether. And social isolation can be cured by men. We're closing libraries, closing pubs, closing clubs, closing churches, places where people met. People in church, it was called the congregation, because it was a congregation of people. And they met and they talked and chatted. There was a club to go to, they went and they talked and they chatted. And these things are all disappearing, and nobody seems to, people in power seem to be just letting it go. And then they said, oh, we've got this terrible thing of social isolation, which is being created by themselves.
Yeah.
It can be cured. Social isolation can be cured.
Yeah. And prevented as well, from what you were saying. So, lady at the front here, for the last comment from the floor. It's coming this way. You've got both directions now.
Reading glasses on. Can you hear me? Have I got it right? Looking around, there aren't many older people here in this hall today. I'm one of them, and I congratulate. There were a few comments. I think it was Peter who said you must talk to the older people. When I worked for money, not for no money, I used to head up a health and social care department in a training college. I thought I knew what older people needed. And it's only as I've got older, I've said this to this group on the table now, it's only as I've got older I realised I wasn't totally correct. I got some things right, but some things wrong. You really have got to talk to the older people to solve the problem.
Great. Thank you very much for all your comments. I'm afraid we do have to wrap up because I don't want to stand too much longer between people and their lunch. But I'm just going to go back to the panel. We have talked a lot, and I think most of the panel, despite their attempts to polarise themselves, made quite clear that they really believe that what we need to tackle loneliness is an approach which involves a whole range of actors working together, and obviously starting with the people that we're ultimately trying to support, so starting with older people. But if that's the case, what is the one thing we now need to make progress on the issue? So what is the one thing that we need?
Well, I suppose for me, we've been asked to say 2 sentences. That's 2 sentences already, isn't it? Is to make the case that there's lots of areas out there, local authorities, whatever, that are doing very little about loneliness. And I think it's our job to get the message out there nationally.
I think for me, it's not just looking in our own backyard. I mean, Ken gave a really good example of what's happening in the Netherlands. There's a lot going on in the rest of Europe, and there's a lot going on in the States. And I think we need to sort of, broaden our outlook and just see what's happening outside of this wonderful island of ours.
I think most local authorities have got this on their radar, but they're probably approaching it in a different way, respective to how they see their locality. I think for me, my final challenge would be about language around this. As I mentioned before, I don't think that term volunteer is quite the right language for the changes that are taking place. I think picking up from Paul's words, the idea that it's citizen-led. We still have local authorities talking in terms of customers. We still have the health service, now increasingly talking in terms of customers. It's about getting that term citizen and all that involves, and the responsibilities that involves, but also your rights as a citizen. I think that, and there's probably a language around isolation and loneliness, a language how we describe community action and creating social value that isn't quite right. We're still using the language of the 60s and 70s in relation to a very different world that we're facing in the future.
Yeah, and interestingly on the language we use, the Department of Health has a national lead on the frail elderly, which in our business is a term you wouldn't use, and it seems to me that there's still a problem at that level. So my one thing, I guess, is that we need a national government-sponsored programme on ageing, which includes loneliness as one of its priorities. We do it in other areas. Why can't we do it in this one?
Great, thank you. We are now moving towards lunchtime, and I have a couple of things just that I need to ask you, which is that please, can you be back in your rooms ready to start your workshops in 45 minutes, at 1:45. Thank you very much. And also, if the panel have made you think about something that in your area isn't happening, a group in your area that should be involved that isn't, or the challenges that they've issued for the various sectors have rung a bell in your mind, make a note, think about what you're going to do about it, because the Campaign to End Loneliness can't make that happen, but you can. So that's the challenge to you to think about over lunchtime, network, swap business cards, and please be back ready to go in 45 minutes. And can we just have one final round of applause to thank our wonderful panel.